Marcus Chen stood at the entrance of Jefferson High School, his military-issued duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The familiar red brick building looked smaller than he remembered, almost laughably fragile compared to the reinforced bunkers and alien structures he had grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. Students flowed around him like water around a stone, their voices creating a cacophony that seemed impossibly loud after months of careful silence in combat zones. He was 17 years old and felt ancient. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard where teenagers clustered in their familiar groups. Marcus watched them with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to assess threats and allies within seconds. The jocks near the flagpole, the theater kids by the steps, the tech enthusiasts huddled around their devices, all of them blissfully unaware that humanity had been fighting for its survival among the stars. 3 years ago, Marcus had been one of them. A sophomore worried about algebra tests and asking Sarah Williams to the winter formal. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, someone he might have known in passing but could barely remember being. The day the recruiters came to Earth, everything changed. Not the usual military recruiters with their polished uniforms and practiced speeches, but representatives of the Terran Defense Corps, humanity's response to first contact with a hostile alien alliance. The hegemony, as the enemy called themselves, had given humanity a choice: submit to incorporation as a servant species or face extinction. Most civilizations chose submission. Humanity chose to fight, and they needed soldiers fast. The age requirements dropped overnight. 16 became the new 18, and Marcus had signed up the day after his birthday, driven by a combination of patriotic fervor and teenage invincibility. Now he was back, part of an experimental program that rotated combat veterans back to civilian life to maintain some connection to what they were fighting for. The theory was sound: keep soldiers grounded in humanity's values and culture. The reality was proving more complicated. Marcus Chen? The voice belonged to Mrs. Rodriguez, his old guidance counselor. She approached with the careful smile adults used when they weren't sure what to say. "Welcome back. We're so glad you're safe." Safe, the word felt strange. Marcus had learned that safety was an illusion, a temporary state between one crisis and the next. He had been safer in the trenches of Kepler 442b. Then he felt standing in this hallway filled with children who thought their biggest problems involved social media, drama, and college applications. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez, it's good to be back." The lie came easily. 3 years of military training had taught him when truth was a luxury he couldn't afford. She handed him a schedule printed on actual paper, another reminder of how different civilian life was from the digital integration of military systems. "I've tried to place you in classes appropriate for your academic level. Given your experiences, the administration thought it best to have you complete your senior year with students your own age." Marcus scanned the list. AP Physics, Advanced Calculus, Government, Literature, and something called Contemporary Social Issues. He almost smiled at the last one. His contemporary social issues involved preventing the extinction of the human race, but he supposed they meant something different here. The bell rang, and the hallway erupted into controlled chaos. Students moved with purpose toward their first classes, and Marcus let the flow carry him toward AP Physics. The classroom was exactly as he remembered. Whiteboards covered in equations, periodic tables hanging slightly crooked, the faint smell of cleaning chemicals and teenage anxiety. He chose a seat in the back corner, an old habit that put his back to the wall and gave him clear sight lines to all entrances. The other students filed in, chatting about weekend plans and homework assignments. None of them looked at him directly, but he could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. Mr. Peterson, the physics teacher, began discussing momentum and energy transfer. Marcus found himself translating the concepts into practical applications: how much kinetic energy a railgun projectile carried, the physics of orbital bombardment, the energy requirements for faster-than-light communication arrays. The academic theory felt disconnected from the brutal reality of its applications. A girl sitting 2 seats ahead turned around during a break in the lecture. She had red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent green eyes that reminded him of Lieutenant Torres, one of the few soldiers in his unit who had made it through the siege of New Geneva. "You're the guy who went to space, right?" she asked quietly. "Jenny Park, I write for the school newspaper." Marcus nodded carefully. The official story was that he had been part of a classified defense program. The truth that he had spent 3 years fighting an interstellar war across a dozen star systems, was compartmentalized at the highest levels. Must be weird being back, Jenny continued. I can't imagine what that transition feels like. She couldn't imagine, and Marcus was grateful for that. How could he explain watching entire colonies burn from orbit? How could he describe the sound a hegemony plasma cannon made when it carved through a bunker full of his friends? How could he tell her about the nightmares that woke him up reaching for weapons that weren't there? It's an adjustment, he said instead. The bell rang again and students began packing up their belongings. Marcus moved more slowly, his mind still partially occupied with calculating firing solutions and threat assessments. As he stood to leave, Mr. Peterson called his name. Marcus, could you stay behind for a moment? The classroom emptied except for the two of them. Mr. Peterson leaned against his desk, studying Marcus with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly complex equation. I know you can't talk about where you've been or what you've done, the teacher said finally, but if you ever need someone to listen or if the academic work feels too simple after everything, I'm here. Marcus appreciated the offer even though he knew it was impossible to accept. How could he explain that calculating orbital mechanics for asteroid mining operations made high school physics feel like finger painting? How could he tell anyone that he had held the line at humanity's furthest outpost while his classmates worried about prom themes? Thank you, Mr. Peterson, I appreciate that. As Marcus walked toward his next class, he passed a group of students gathered around someone's phone, watching a video that made them laugh until they nearly cried. Their joy was infectious and alien, a reminder of what humanity was fighting to preserve. He had forgotten that people could laugh like that, without checking the sky for incoming projectiles or scanning for hostile movement. This was going to be harder than any battle he had faced among the stars. The cafeteria assault began during third period. Marcus was sitting in government class, half listening to a discussion about the separation of powers, when the fire alarm started blaring. But this wasn't the steady rhythm of a drill. It was the rapid, staccato burst that meant real danger. His body reacted before his mind caught up. Marcus was out of his seat and moving toward the window before the teacher had finished saying, "Everyone remain calm." Through the glass, he could see smoke rising from the cafeteria building, and something else that made his blood freeze, the distinctive blue flash of plasma weapons. The hegemony had found Earth. While his classmates filed toward the door in confused clusters, Marcus was already calculating. The cafeteria was the logical first target, maximum casualties, psychological impact, and a central location that would allow attackers to control access to the rest of the school. Standard hegemony tactics for subjugating a civilian population. Marcus, where are you going? Mrs. Patterson called as he moved away from the evacuation route. Bathroom, he lied, slipping out the back door of the classroom. The hallways were chaos. Students streamed past him toward the exits, their voices high with excitement and fear. They thought this was a fire, maybe a gas leak. They had no idea they were in the opening moments of an alien invasion. Marcus moved against the crowd, his military training taking over. He needed weapons, communication, and intelligence. The school's security office would have radio contact with local law enforcement, but he doubted the police would understand what they were facing. The nearest military installation was Fort Davidson, 40 miles away. Too far. He reached his locker and spun the combination from muscle memory. Inside, beneath textbooks he hadn't opened yet, was his emergency kit, something every returning veteran was required to maintain. The contents looked innocuous enough. A multi-tool, emergency rations, a first aid kit, and what appeared to be a standard smartphone, but was actually a military-grade communication device. The phone connected to the Terran Defense Corps' emergency network within seconds. Marcus spoke quickly into the device using authentication codes he prayed were still valid. Warfighter 77 Alpha requesting immediate support. Hostile contact at Jefferson High School, Millbrook Township. Multiple plasma signatures. Estimated squad-level hegemony force. Civilian population at risk. The response came through his earpiece almost immediately. 77 Alpha, this is command. We show no authorized hegemony activity in your sector. Are you certain of contact? Another plasma blast lit up the cafeteria windows and screams echoed down the hallway. Affirmative contact. Request immediate evac and close air support. Negative on air support 77 Alpha. Political situation requires minimal exposure. Local assets only. Be advised, Diplomatic teams are en route. Diplomatic teams. Marcus wanted to laugh, but there wasn't time. The hegemony didn't negotiate during active operations. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't official. He closed the connection and moved toward the cafeteria, staying low and using the lockers for cover. The hallway stretched ahead of him like the approach to a bunker complex on Tau Ceti. But instead of trained Marines at his back, he had 17-year-olds who thought alien invasion was something that happened in movies. The first body he found was Mr. Williams, the vice principal. The man lay crumpled near the cafeteria entrance, his shirt burned away by a plasma blast that had cauterized the wound instantly. Marcus checked for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there, then carefully took the man's radio and keys. Voices echoed from inside the cafeteria, not human voices, but the clicking, chittering speech of hegemony soldiers. Marcus had heard that sound in his nightmares for months. He pressed himself against the wall beside the entrance and listened. The young ones are more compliant, one voice said in accented English. Separate them from the older specimens. Understood. The research teams will want a full sample range. Research teams. This wasn't an invasion, it was a harvesting operation. Someone in the hegemony had found Earth despite the military's best efforts to keep their location secret, and they were collecting human subjects for experimentation. Marcus keyed the radio to the school's emergency frequency.
All staff, this is Marcus Chen. Do not approach the cafeteria.
We have hostile intruders with advanced weapons. Evacuate all students to the gym and lock down. This is not a drill. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static. Marcus, what are you talking about? The fire department says, the fire department doesn't know what they're dealing with. Keep everyone away from the cafeteria and call for military support. Tell them we have a Code Omega situation. Code Omega was the designation for alien contact on Earth. Most people didn't know it existed, but emergency services had been briefed after first contact. If Mrs. Rodriguez followed protocol, she would bypass local law enforcement and contact the defense grid directly. A movement in his peripheral vision made Marcus turn. A figure in form-fitting armor was emerging from the cafeteria's side entrance, moving with the predatory grace that had made hegemony soldiers so effective. The being was roughly humanoid but wrong in a dozen subtle ways. Too tall, joints that bent at impossible angles, skin that shifted color like a cuttlefish. The creature carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a rifle and a piece of modern art, all flowing lines and crystalline components. Marcus had seen what those weapons could do to human bodies. He had also learned how to kill the things that carried them. The alien hadn't noticed him yet, focused instead on hurting a group of students who had been caught outside during the evacuation. Marcus recognized some of them. Kevin Park from his physics class, Sarah Chen who worked in the library, 3 freshmen whose names he didn't know but whose terror was written across their faces. Marcus moved without thinking, 3 years of combat experience taking over. He came up behind the hegemony soldier in complete silence, one hand clamping over what passed for its mouth while the other found the nerve cluster at the base of its skull. The creature dropped without a sound, its weapon clattering to the floor. The students stared at him in shock. Kevin Park's mouth moved soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak. How did you... What was that thing? Get to the gym, Marcus said, picking up the alien weapon. The grip was wrong for human hands, but he had trained with captured hegemony equipment. Find Mrs. Rodriguez and tell her Marcus says Code Omega is confirmed. Move quietly and stay together. They ran, leaving Marcus alone with the unconscious alien and a weapon that hummed with barely contained energy. He checked the creature's equipment, finding the standard kit of a hegemony researcher, sample containers, neural probes, and a communication device that was already chattering with status reports. Through the cafeteria windows, he could see more figures moving among the tables where students should have been eating lunch. The harvesting operation was larger than he had initially thought. At least a dozen soldiers, probably more. Too many for one person to handle, even with their own weapons. But Marcus had learned something important during his time in the war. Humans didn't have to fight fair. They just had to fight smart. He activated the alien communication device and began speaking in the clicking language he had learned during interrogation training. To the hegemony soldiers inside, it would sound like their missing team member reporting in. Perimeter secure, he reported, beginning specimen extraction from secondary location. It would buy him time, maybe enough to even the odds. Marcus began moving toward the school's chemistry lab, his mind already working through the components he would need. The hegemony had advanced technology, but they had never faced a human teenager with 3 years of military training and access to a high school science department. The real war was about to begin. The chemistry lab smelled like sulfur and teenage ambition. Marcus worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he assembled components that would have made his old drill sergeant proud. 3 years of asymmetric warfare had taught him that the best weapons were often the ones your enemy never saw coming. From the cafeteria, he could hear the hegemony soldiers coordinating their specimen collection. Their translator implants rendered their clicking speech into clinical English that made his skin crawl. Batch 7 secured. Subjects show optimal stress response patterns. Acknowledged. Research vessel ETA 15 minutes, 15 minutes. Marcus had faced worse odds with less time, but never with so many innocent lives at stake. On Kepler 442b, when the hegemony overran their position, he had been surrounded by trained soldiers who knew the risks. These were kids who yesterday worried about pop quizzes and prom dates. His fingers found the familiar weight of the multi-tool at his belt as he mixed compounds that were probably illegal under several interstellar treaties. The hegemony's greatest strength was their technology, but it was also their weakness. They relied so heavily on their advanced systems that they often overlooked simple, primitive solutions. A soft footstep in the hallway made him freeze. Someone was approaching the lab, moving with the careful stealth of a person trying not to be noticed. Marcus palmed a small explosive charge he had just finished assembling and positioned himself beside the door. Jenny Park slipped into the room, her red hair disheveled and her green eyes wide with controlled panic. She carried a fire extinguisher like a weapon and moved with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to be afraid. "Marcus," she whispered. "Thank God. I saw what happened to Mr. Williams and those things in the cafeteria." She shuddered. "What are they?" "Hegemony research team," Marcus said, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "They're collecting human specimens for experimentation." "How many students are still in the building?" "Maybe 30 in the cafeteria. Mrs. Rodriguez got most everyone else to the gym, but some kids hid when the alarm went off." Jenny's voice was steady despite her fear. "The things outside, they look like they're setting up some kind of barrier around the school." Containment field. Standard procedure for a harvesting operation. The hegemony would lock down the area, extract their specimens, and leave behind a cover story about a gas leak or terrorist attack. By tomorrow, this would be a footnote in local news. And 30 kids would be halfway to a research facility in another star system. "I need you to get to the gym and help Mrs. Rodriguez keep everyone calm," Marcus said. "Military support is coming, but..." "No." Jenny's voice was quiet but firm. "My little brother David is in that cafeteria. Those things have him, and I'm not leaving without him." Marcus recognized the expression on her face. He had seen it in the mirror during the siege of New Geneva, when the hegemony had his squad pinned down and the only choice was to fight or watch his friends die. It was the look of someone who had found their line in the sand. "You'll get yourself killed," he said. "Maybe. But David's only 15, and he's terrified of loud noises because of his autism. He's probably having a complete meltdown right now, and those things won't understand." She trailed off, but Marcus could fill in the blanks. The hegemony didn't have a concept of neurodiversity. To them, David would just be a defective specimen. Marcus weighed his options. Jenny was untrained, but she knew the school layout better than he did. She was also clearly intelligent and had managed to avoid capture so far. More importantly, she had information he needed. The barrier they're setting up. Did you see where the control node is? There's some kind of device on a tripod near the main entrance. It's making this humming sound, and there's, I don't know, like a shimmer in the air around it. Exactly what he expected. Hegemony containment fields had a single point of failure by design. If the primary node was destroyed, the entire field would collapse. It was meant to prevent their own forces from being trapped, but it also created an opportunity. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, handing Jenny one of his improvised explosives. "This is a thermite charge. You get as close to that tripod device as you can and attach this to its base. When I give the signal, you trigger it and run." "What's the signal?" "You'll know it when you see it." Marcus gathered his remaining supplies, 3 more charges, the captured hegemony weapon, and a length of electrical wire that would serve as a detonator cord. His plan was insane by any military standard. but sanity was a luxury he couldn't afford. They moved through the hallways like ghosts, staying low and using classroom doors for cover. The building felt wrong now, transformed from a place of learning into a hunting ground. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows, and the normally comforting sounds of teenagers talking and laughing had been replaced by an ominous silence. Near the main entrance, they could see the containment field generator, a sleek device that looked like a metallic flower with crystalline petals. 2 hegemony soldiers stood guard beside it, their weapons held in the relaxed grip of professionals who didn't expect trouble. "Remember," Marcus whispered to Jenny, "attach the charge to the base, wait for my signal, then run for the gym. Don't look back, don't try to help. Just run." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "What about David?" "I'll get him out. All of them." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but it was what she needed to hear. Jenny slipped away toward the entrance, moving with surprising stealth for someone who had never seen combat. Marcus headed in the opposite direction, toward the cafeteria, and the sound of alien voices coordinating their harvest. Through the windows he could see students huddled in groups, their faces blank with shock and terror. Some were crying silently. Others stared at nothing, their minds unable to process what was happening to them. He found David Park exactly where Jenny had predicted, curled in a corner, rocking back and forth with his hands pressed over his ears. The boy's eyes were squeezed shut, and Marcus could see his lips moving in what looked like a mathematical sequence. A coping mechanism, probably something he used to deal with overwhelming sensory input. 3 hegemony soldiers moved between the groups of students, taking biological samples and making notes on handheld devices. They worked with the detached efficiency of farmers sorting livestock, occasionally pausing to examine a particularly interesting specimen more closely. Marcus positioned his remaining charges at strategic points around the cafeteria, load-bearing pillars that would bring down part of the ceiling when they detonated. It wouldn't kill the hegemony soldiers outright, but it would create chaos and cover. In chaos, humans thrived while aliens relied on technology and coordination. His communication device buzzed with an incoming message. Command was finally responding to his earlier call. 7-7 Alpha. Be advised, diplomatic contact established with hegemony research vessel. Stand down and avoid engagement. Marcus stared at the message in disbelief. Diplomatic contact. While children were being processed like cattle, someone in a comfortable office was trying to negotiate. He typed back a response that would probably get him court-martialed if he survived the next 10 minutes. Negative, command. Specimens are being extracted. Diplomatic solution not viable. Engaging hostile forces. He turned off the device and checked his weapon one last time. Through the windows he could see Jenny approaching the containment field generator, the thermite charge clutched in her trembling hands. The real test of humanity wasn't in the grand battles among the stars or the diplomatic negotiations in distant conference rooms. It was here, in the choice between following orders and doing what was right. It was in the decision to fight impossible odds because someone had to. Marcus took a deep breath and prepared to remind the galaxy why humans were so dangerous. Wasn't because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. It was because when everything went wrong, when the situation was hopeless and the odds were impossible, humans did something that no other species could understand. They fought anyway. The first explosion lit up the main entrance like a miniature star going nova. Jenny's thermite charge had found its mark, and the containment field generator died in a cascade of sparks and melting metal. The shimmer in the air vanished, and suddenly the school was no longer cut off from the outside world. Marcus didn't wait to see if Jenny had made it to safety. He triggered his own charges in sequence, and the cafeteria erupted into controlled chaos. Ceiling tiles crashed down, emergency sprinklers activated, and the carefully ordered specimen collection turned into a nightmare of confusion and flying debris. The hegemony soldiers reacted exactly as their training dictated. They sought cover and attempted to establish communication with their command structure. What they didn't expect was a human teenager dropping from the ceiling access panel directly into their midst, armed with their own weapons and 3 years of experience in making impossible situations work in his favor. Marcus landed hard on the nearest soldier, driving his knee into the creature's spine while simultaneously firing the captured plasma weapon into the chest of its partner. The distinctive whine crack of hegemony energy discharge filled the air, and students who had been paralyzed by shock suddenly found their voices. "Everyone down," Marcus shouted over the chaos. "Stay low and move toward the exits." Some of the students responded immediately, military families who had drilled for emergencies. Others remained frozen, their minds still trying to process the impossibility of their situation. Marcus grabbed David Park by the shoulder, pulling the boy to his feet while firing at another hegemony soldier who was trying to establish a defensive position. "David, look at me." Marcus's voice cut through the boy's panic. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to help me. Can you count backwards from 100 by sevens?" It was a guess based on what he had observed earlier, but it worked. David's eyes focused on Marcus's face and his lips began moving in the familiar pattern of mathematical calculation. The repetitive task gave him something to anchor on while his world collapsed around him. 93, David whispered. "Good. Keep counting and follow me. Don't stop counting no matter what happens." Marcus pushed through the chaos, one arm around David and the other wielding the plasma weapon with deadly efficiency. Years of urban combat had taught him to use confusion as a force multiplier. The hegemony soldiers were trained for sterilized laboratory conditions, not a teenage insurgency in a debris-filled cafeteria. A plasma bolt seared past his ear, close enough that he could smell his own burned hair. Marcus spun and returned fire, his shot taking the alien soldier center mass and dropping it instantly. The weapon's targeting system was designed for hegemony physiology, but he had learned to compensate for the differences during his time in the war. 86. David continued counting, his voice growing stronger. More students were moving now, following Marcus's example and heading for the exits. Sarah Chen helped a freshman who had been stunned by falling debris. Kevin Park grabbed another boy who seemed paralyzed by shock and physically dragged him toward safety. The human response to crisis was kicking in, not every person for themselves, but the strong helping the weak. A new sound filled the air, the distinctive whine of hegemony reinforcements arriving. Through the broken windows, Marcus could see dropships descending from orbit, their angular forms cutting through the afternoon sky like black daggers. The research team had called for backup, and the situation was about to become exponentially more dangerous. 79, David said, his mathematical mantra keeping him functional despite the chaos around them. Marcus's communication device crackled to life. 77 Alpha, this is Falcon 1-2. We have eyes on your position. Hang tight, kid. The voice belonged to Colonel Sarah Martinez, Marcus's former commanding officer and one of the few people who understood exactly what was at stake. The fact that she was here meant command had finally grasped the seriousness of the situation. Falcon 1-2, be advised, multiple civilian hostages still in the building. Hegemony research team calling in reinforcements. Copy that, 77 Alpha. We have fast movers inbound. Get those civilians clear and mark your position. Fast movers meant atmospheric fighters, probably the new X-47 interceptors that had proven so effective against hegemony dropships. But air support would only be useful if the civilians were out of the target area. Marcus reached the cafeteria exit as another wave of hegemony soldiers poured through the main entrance. These weren't researchers, they were combat troops in full battle armor, moving with the coordinated precision that had made them the dominant force in 3/4 of the galaxy. 72, David continued, his voice steady despite the violence erupting around them. Everyone to the gym, Marcus shouted to the fleeing students. Mrs. Rodriguez will keep you safe. A plasma bolt punched through the wall beside his head, leaving a hole large enough to put his fist through. Marcus returned fire, forcing the advancing soldiers to take cover behind overturned tables. But he was outnumbered 20-1, and even his captured weapon was running low on power. That was when Kevin Park did something extraordinary. The boy had made it to the exit, but stopped when he saw Marcus pinned down by enemy fire. Instead of running to safety like any rational person would do, Kevin grabbed one of the emergency fire axes from the wall and charged back into the cafeteria. Kevin, no, Marcus yelled, but the teenager was already moving. Kevin Park might have been a straight-A student with plans for MIT, but he was also the son of Staff Sergeant Park, killed in action above Proxima Centauri 2 years earlier. He had grown up hearing stories about courage under fire, and when the moment came to live up to his father's example, he didn't hesitate. The boy's attack was completely unexpected by hegemony tactical standards. Their combat algorithms didn't account for untrained civilians launching suicidal frontal assaults with primitive weapons. Kevin's fire axe caught the nearest soldier across the torso, the impact sending the creature sprawling and creating enough confusion for Marcus to break from cover. 65, David said, still counting as Marcus grabbed him and Kevin and headed for the exit. But the hegemony soldiers were adapting quickly, their tactical systems updating to account for human unpredictability. A line of armed figures blocked their path to safety, weapons trained on the fleeing students with the cold precision of professional killers. Marcus stepped in front of the two boys, his captured weapon aimed at the nearest threat. He had enough power for maybe 3 shots, and there were 8 soldiers between them and the exit. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. 58, David whispered. That was when the windows exploded inward, and the cavalry arrived. Colonel Martinez came through the glass like an avenging angel, her powered armor absorbing plasma bolts that would have killed an unprotected human. Behind her came Alpha Squad, the same soldiers Marcus had fought beside in the outer colonies, now bringing their hard-won experience to Earth's defense. The hegemony soldiers turned to meet this new threat, their tactical systems struggling to process the sudden shift in battlefield dynamics. In that moment of confusion, Marcus saw his chance. "Run!" he shouted to David and Kevin. The 3 of them sprinted for the exit as the cafeteria became a war zone. Behind them, plasma fire and human weapons created a deadly light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. They burst through the exit doors into afternoon sunlight that felt like salvation itself. Other students were streaming toward the gym, guided by teachers who had maintained their composure despite circumstances that would have broken most adults. Marcus looked back at the cafeteria, now lit by weapons fire and filled with the sounds of battle. Colonel Martinez and her team were pushing the hegemony forces back, but the cost was measured in the structural damage to a building where children were supposed to learn about literature and mathematics. 51, David said, his counting finally slowing as they reached relative safety. Kevin Park was staring at his hands, still holding the fire axe and probably realizing for the first time what he had just done. "I attacked an alien with a fire axe," he said in wonder. "Yes, you did," Marcus replied. "Your father would be proud." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of pride, of a son living up to the memory of a hero. Overhead, the X-47 interceptors screamed past in attack formation, their weapons already engaging the hegemony dropships. The real battle for Earth was just beginning. But in a high school cafeteria, humanity had already won the most important victory. They had proven that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The gymnasium had been transformed into a battlefield command center. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the center of it all, her teacher's instincts for crowd control serving her well as she coordinated the evacuation of 300 teenagers while military personnel established defensive positions around the building. Marcus found himself at the intersection of 2 worlds that weren't supposed to meet. On one side, students huddled together in groups that reflected the familiar hierarchies of high school life. On the other, Colonel Martinez and her team worked with the efficient brutality of soldiers who had spent years fighting an enemy most humans didn't know existed. "Sit rep, Marcus," Colonel Martinez said as he approached. She was out of her powered armor now, revealing the scars and weathered face of someone who had seen too much combat. "How many civilians were extracted from the research site?" 28 confirmed safe, 2 wounded but stable. The hegemony team was collecting biological samples, not conducting terminations. Marcus paused, then added, "They were setting up for transport to a research vessel." The colonel's expression darkened. Hegemony research vessels were mobile laboratories where captured species were studied, dissected, and eventually processed into whatever form best served the Empire's needs. The lucky subjects died quickly. "The diplomatic team thinks this is an isolated incident," Martinez said quietly. "Some kind of rogue operation that doesn't represent official hegemony policy." Marcus wanted to laugh, but the sound that came out was bitter and sharp. "Tell that to the kids who were being prepped for specimen containers." "I know. But Earth's government is trying to maintain the peace treaty. They don't want this incident to spark a full-scale invasion." The peace treaty. Marcus had heard rumors about it during his last deployment. Whispers that certain elements in Earth's government were negotiating a surrender disguised as a diplomatic solution. The theory was that voluntary submission would preserve more human lives than continued resistance. What about the students? Marcus asked. They saw everything. You can't cover this up. Memory modification protocols are already being prepared. By tomorrow, they'll remember a gas leak and a terrorist attack. Standard procedure for containing unauthorized contact. Memory modification. The technology existed, borrowed from captured hegemony equipment and adapted for human neurology. It was clean, efficient, and completely destroyed any chance these kids had of understanding what was really happening to their world. That's wrong, Marcus said, Colonel. Martinez looked at him with the tired eyes of someone who had made too many impossible choices. Maybe, but it's necessary. These kids get to go back to their normal lives, instead of spending the rest of their existence looking over their shoulders for alien hunters. Their normal lives built on a lie. Sometimes lies are kinder than truth, Marcus looked around the gymnasium at the faces of his classmates. Jenny Park sat with her arm around her brother David, both of them safe but forever changed by what they had experienced. Kevin Park was talking to a military medic, describing his attack on the hegemony soldier with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered courage he didn't know he possessed. These weren't just random civilians anymore. They were people who had looked into the darkness between the stars and found the strength to fight back. They deserved better than having their memories stolen. What if there was another way? Marcus asked. There isn't. What if I could prove that humans are more effective when they know the truth? Colonel Martinez studied him carefully. What are you thinking? Before Marcus could answer, alarms started blaring throughout the building. The distinctive wail of air raid sirens meant only one thing: incoming orbital bombardment. The hegemony had decided that diplomatic solutions were no longer worth pursuing. Through the gymnasium windows, Marcus could see streaks of light falling from the sky like deadly rain. The orbital strikes weren't aimed at the school. They were targeting military installations, communication hubs, and government facilities. The systematic destruction of Earth's defensive infrastructure. All students down, Mrs. Rodriguez shouted, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years managing teenagers. Take cover under the bleachers. But the students weren't moving fast enough. Fear had paralyzed them, their minds struggling to process the reality of planetary bombardment. These were kids who had grown up believing that Earth was safe, that the wars were fought in distant star systems by other people. That was when Jenny Park stood up. Listen to me, she called out, her voice cutting through the panic. Those things we saw today, they're not gone. They're coming back, and they're bringing friends. We can either hide and hope someone else saves us, or we can figure out how to save ourselves. Her words had an electric effect on the crowd. Students who had been paralyzed by shock suddenly found their voices, their courage, their humanity. They began organizing themselves into groups, helping the wounded, securing the entrances, turning the gymnasium into a fortress. How do we fight them? Someone called out. We think, Jenny replied. They have better technology, but we have something they don't understand. We have each other. Marcus watched in amazement as his classmates transformed from frightened children into something approaching a military unit. It wasn't professional or polished, but it was undeniably human. They were adapting, improvising, refusing to surrender even when the situation seemed hopeless. David Park, still counting softly to himself, had found a laptop and was working on something that looked like code. Their communication frequencies, he said to anyone who was listening. They're using quantum entanglement for instantaneous transmission, but the encryption is pattern-based. If I can map the mathematical relationships. Kevin Park was organizing the athletic teams into security squads, using his knowledge of the school's layout to establish defensive positions. The hegemony soldiers move in groups of 4, he told his improvised squad leaders. Standard formation puts the heavy weapon in the back left position. If we can isolate them. Sarah Chen had taken charge of the wounded, applying first aid techniques she had learned in health class and adapting them for injuries caused by alien weapons. Plasma burns cauterize the wound, she explained to her helpers, but they also cause deep tissue damage. We need to watch for shock and internal bleeding. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the siege of New Geneva. Hope. These weren't soldiers, but they were becoming something that might be even more dangerous. They were becoming humans who understood what was at stake. Colonel, he said quietly, I think you need to see this. Martinez had been watching the same transformation, her expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching awe. They're organizing without training, without equipment, without any of the advantages we consider essential for military operations. That's what makes us dangerous, Marcus replied. We don't need advantages. We just need a reason to fight. Another wave of orbital strikes lit up the horizon, and the building shook with the impact of weapons that could crack mountains. But the students didn't break. They bent. They adapted. They found ways to make the impossible possible. The memory modification protocols, Colonel Martinez said slowly. Maybe you're right. Maybe lies aren't kinder than truth. These kids have already seen what's coming, Marcus said. The question is whether we trust them to help us fight it. Through the windows, dropships were descending again, not just over the school but across the entire city. The hegemony had abandoned any pretense of secrecy or diplomacy. This was an invasion, and Earth's defenders were about to discover what humans could accomplish when they stopped fighting as soldiers and started fighting as a species. Marcus looked around the gymnasium one more time, at teenagers who had spent the morning worrying about homework and were now planning asymmetric warfare against an alien empire. Welcome to the real war, he said quietly. The hegemony was about to learn why humans were considered the most dangerous species in the galaxy. It wasn't because of their technology or their tactics or their military might. It was because when everything was on the line, humans became something more than the sum of their parts. They became hope with teeth. The transformation happened faster than anyone thought possible. Within 6 hours of the first orbital strike, Jefferson High School had become the nerve center of a resistance network that stretched across 3 counties. Students who had never given a thought to military strategy were coordinating with farmers, factory workers, and suburban families to create something the hegemony had never encountered before, a civilian population that refused to be conquered. Marcus stood in what used to be the school library, now serving as a communications hub where David Park's improvised quantum interference system was wreaking havoc on hegemony coordination networks. The boy had somehow managed to turn a collection of smartphones, Wi-Fi routers, and salvaged alien technology into a device that could scramble enemy communications across a 50-mile radius. Their tactical systems rely on constant data exchange, David explained to Colonel Martinez, his earlier panic replaced by the focused intensity of a mathematician who had found the perfect equation. But if I introduce random variables into their quantum stream, their coordination algorithms start making mistakes. On the main display, Marcus could see the results of those mistakes. Hegemony ground units were converging on empty buildings. Their air support was bombing their own positions, and their command structure was issuing contradictory orders that left entire battalions confused and vulnerable. How long can you maintain the interference? The colonel asked. As long as the power holds out, David replied. But they're adapting. I'd estimate maybe 12 more hours before they develop countermeasures. 12 hours. In military terms, it was an eternity. In the broader context of Earth's survival, it was barely enough time to evacuate the most critical personnel. But for the teenagers of Jefferson High, it was more than enough time to prove a point that would echo across the galaxy. Jenny Park burst into the library, her red hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes stained with the kind of grime that came from crawling through ventilation systems. Marcus, we have a problem. The hegemony is moving heavy equipment toward the elementary school. The elementary school. Marcus felt his blood chill. If the hegemony was targeting younger children, it meant they were escalating to a full harvest operation. Not just research specimens, but wholesale population processing. How heavy? He asked. Containment vehicles. The big ones. Jenny's voice was grim. Mrs. Patterson managed to evacuate most of the kids before the bombardment started, but there are still about 40 children trapped in the building with 3 teachers. 40 children. The youngest was probably 5 years old. Marcus had seen what hegemony containment vehicles did to their cargo, and the image of kindergartners being processed like livestock made his vision blur with rage. We can't mount an assault, Colonel Martinez said. Alpha Squad is already stretched thin covering the evacuation routes. I don't have the personnel for a rescue operation. Then we make personnel, Marcus replied. He turned to address the room full of teenagers who had become his impromptu army. Listen up. The hegemony is targeting the elementary school. 40 kids are trapped and we're the only ones in position to help them. The response was immediate and unanimous. Kevin Park stepped forward first, still carrying the fire axe that had become his signature weapon. "What do you need us to do?" Sarah Chen was already gathering medical supplies. "Those children are going to be terrified. We'll need trauma counselors, not just soldiers." A sophomore named Mike Torres raised his hand. "My dad works construction. I know how to operate heavy machinery. If we need to bring down walls or create diversions." Jenny Park was studying the tactical display with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "The containment vehicles have a weakness. Their loading mechanisms require a stable platform. If we can destabilize the ground around the school..." Marcus felt the same electric sensation he had experienced during the siege of New Geneva, the moment when a group of individuals became something greater than themselves. These weren't trained soldiers, but they were something potentially more dangerous. Humans who had decided that some things were worth dying for. "Here's the plan," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he had learned during 3 years of impossible missions. "We split into 3 teams. Team Alpha creates a diversion at the north entrance to draw the main hegemony force. Team Beta infiltrates through the maintenance tunnels and secures the children. Team Charlie sets up overwatch positions to provide covering fire during the extraction." "What about Team Delta?" asked a voice from the back of the room. Marcus smiled grimly. "Team Delta is David's quantum interference system. As long as he can keep the hegemony coordination network scrambled, we have a chance." Colonel Martinez looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Marcus, these are civilians. Most of them have never seen combat. Most of the Marines at New Geneva had never seen combat either," Marcus replied. "But they learned fast when they had to." The colonel studied the faces around the room. Teenagers who should have been worrying about college applications and weekend plans, now preparing to assault an alien military position. "If you're wrong about this..." "If I'm wrong, 40 children die anyway. At least this way we're fighting." 2 hours later, Marcus crouched in the drainage tunnel beneath Jefferson Elementary, surrounded by 15 teenagers who had somehow acquired military-grade equipment and the kind of focused determination that came from defending something precious. Jenny Park checked her communications gear one more time. "Team Alpha is in position. Kevin says the hegemony guards are responding to his diversions." "Team Charlie?" Marcus asked. "Sarah's got sniper positions established in the surrounding buildings. She's never fired a rifle before today, but she's got steady hands and good eyes." Marcus nodded. Sarah Chen had been the best student in advanced biology, with plans to become a surgeon. The transition from healing to killing wasn't easy for anyone, but sometimes the skills overlapped in unexpected ways. "Team Delta?" "David's interference is holding. Hegemony coordination is still scrambled, but he's starting to see adaptation patterns in their algorithms." Time was running out. Marcus could hear the low hum of containment vehicles warming up their processing systems. Soon those machines would begin the systematic collection of 40 children who had never done anything worse than forget their homework or talk during story time. "Move out," Marcus whispered. They emerged from the drainage system into the elementary school's basement, a familiar maze of boiler rooms and storage areas that felt like a dollhouse version of the industrial complexes where Marcus had fought his war. The hegemony soldiers had secured the main entrances, but they hadn't bothered with the maintenance areas, a mistake that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of human resourcefulness. The sound of children crying echoed through the ventilation system, mixed with the calm voices of teachers trying to maintain order in an impossible situation. Mrs. Patterson's voice was strongest, reading a story about brave knights and magical kingdoms to children who were living through something far more terrifying than any fairy tale. Marcus led his team, through corridors lined with artwork and achievement certificates, past classrooms where children had been learning about friendship and sharing just hours before. The incongruity was almost overwhelming. The innocent decorations of childhood surrounded by the clinical efficiency of an alien occupation. At the main hallway intersection, they encountered their first hegemony guard. The creature was focused on its handheld scanner, probably monitoring the containment vehicle's collection parameters. It never saw the fire axe that Kevin Park swung with deadly precision, or the improvised explosives that turned the intersection into a crater. The elementary school erupted into controlled chaos. Team Alpha's diversions triggered hegemony response protocols, drawing soldiers away from the primary collection site. Team Charlie's covering fire kept the remaining guards. pinned down while Team Beta moved through the building like a rescue operation that had been planned for months. Instead of hours, Marcus found the children huddled in the gymnasium, 40 small faces looking up at him with the trust that only very young humans could maintain in the face of absolute terror. Mrs. Patterson stood in front of them like a protective shield, her voice steady as she continued reading her story about heroes who saved the day. "It's okay," Marcus told the children, his voice gentle despite the weapons fire echoing through the building. "We're here to take you home. The Diora evacuation was textbook perfect, a flowing movement of small bodies guided by teenagers who had learned military tactics from video games and applied them with deadly seriousness. Jenny Park carried a kindergartner who was too scared to walk. Sarah Chen provided medical attention to a second grader who had been injured by falling debris. Kevin Park covered their withdrawal with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered his calling. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Marcus looked back at the elementary school where containment vehicles sat empty, and hegemony soldiers struggled to understand how their perfectly planned operation had been completely dismantled by a force they hadn't considered a threat. 40 children were safe. The transformation happened faster than anyone thought possible. Within 6 hours of the first orbital strike, Jefferson High School had become the nerve center of a resistance network that stretched across 3 counties. Students who had never given a thought to military strategy were coordinating with farmers, factory workers, and suburban families to create something the hegemony had never encountered before, a civilian population that refused to be conquered. Marcus stood in what used to be the school library, now serving as a communications hub where David Park's improvised quantum interference system was wreaking havoc on hegemony coordination networks. The boy had somehow managed to turn a collection of smartphones, Wi-Fi routers, and salvaged alien technology into a device that could scramble enemy communications across a 50-mile radius. Their tactical systems rely on constant data exchange, David explained to Colonel Martinez, his earlier panic replaced by the focused intensity of a mathematician who had found the perfect equation. But if I introduce random variables into their quantum stream, their coordination algorithms start making mistakes. On the main display, Marcus could see the results of those mistakes. Hegemony ground units were converging on empty buildings. Their air support was bombing their own positions, and their command structure was issuing contradictory orders that left entire battalions confused and vulnerable. "How long can you maintain the interference?" the colonel asked. "As long as the power holds out," David replied. "But they're adapting. I'd estimate maybe 12 more hours before they develop countermeasures." 12 hours. In military terms, it was an eternity. In the broader context of Earth's survival, it was barely enough time to evacuate the most critical personnel. But for the teenagers of Jefferson High, it was more than enough time to prove a point that would echo across the galaxy. Jenny Park burst into the library, her red hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes stained with the kind of grime that came from crawling through ventilation systems. "Marcus, we have a problem. The hegemony is moving heavy equipment toward the elementary school." The elementary school. Marcus felt his blood chill. If the hegemony was targeting younger children, it meant they were escalating to a full harvest operation. Not just research specimens, but wholesale population processing. "How heavy?" he asked. "Containment vehicles. The big ones." Jenny's voice was grim. Mrs. Patterson managed to evacuate most of the kids before the bombardment started, but there are still about 40 children trapped in the building with 3 teachers. 40 children. The youngest was probably 5 years old. Marcus had seen what hegemony containment vehicles did to their cargo, and the image of kindergartners being processed like livestock made his vision blur with rage. "We can't mount an assault," Colonel Martinez said. "Alpha Squad is already stretched thin covering the evacuation routes. I don't have the personnel for a rescue operation." "Then we make personnel," Marcus replied. He turned to address the room full of teenagers who had become his impromptu army. "Listen up. The hegemony is targeting the elementary school. 40 kids are trapped and we're the only ones in position to help them." The response was immediate and unanimous. Kevin Park stepped forward first, still carrying the fire axe that had become his signature weapon. "What do you need us to do?" Sarah Chen was already gathering medical supplies. "Those children are going to be terrified. We'll need trauma counselors, not just soldiers. A sophomore named Mike Torres raised his hand. My dad works construction. I know how to operate heavy machinery. If we need to bring down walls or create diversions. Jenny Park was studying the tactical display with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The containment vehicles have a weakness. Their loading mechanisms require a stable platform. If we can destabilize the ground around the school, Marcus felt the same electric sensation he had experienced during the siege of New Geneva, the moment when a group of individuals became something greater than themselves. These weren't trained soldiers, but they were something potentially more dangerous. Humans who had decided that some things were worth dying for. Here's the plan, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he had learned during 3 years of impossible missions. We split into 3 teams. Team Alpha creates a diversion at the north entrance to draw the main hegemony force. Team Beta infiltrates through the maintenance tunnels and secures the children. Team Charlie sets up overwatch positions to provide covering fire during the extraction. What about Team Delta? Asked a voice from the back of the room. Marcus smiled grimly. Team Delta is David's quantum interference system. As long as he can keep the hegemony coordination network scrambled, we have a chance. Colonel Martinez looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Marcus, these are civilians. Most of them have never seen combat. Most of the Marines at New Geneva had never seen combat either, Marcus replied. But they learned fast when they had to. The colonel studied the faces around the room, teenagers who should have been worrying about college applications and weekend plans, now preparing to assault an alien military position. If you're wrong about this, if I'm wrong, 40 children die anyway. At least this way we're fighting. 2 hours later, Marcus crouched in the drainage tunnel beneath Jefferson Elementary, surrounded by 15 teenagers who had somehow acquired military-grade equipment and the kind of focused determination that came from defending something precious. Jenny Park checked her communications gear one more time. Team Alpha is in position. Kevin says the hegemony guards are responding to his diversions. Team Charlie? Marcus asked. Sarah's got sniper positions established in the surrounding buildings. She's never fired a rifle before today, but she's got steady hands and good eyes. Marcus nodded. Sarah Chen had been the best student in advanced biology, with plans to become a surgeon. The transition from healing to killing wasn't easy for anyone, but sometimes the skills overlapped in unexpected ways. Team Delta? David's interference is holding. Hegemony coordination is still scrambled, but he's starting to see adaptation patterns in their algorithms. Time was running out. Marcus could hear the low hum of containment vehicles warming up their processing systems. Soon those machines would begin the systematic collection of 40 children who had never done anything worse than forget their homework or talk during story time. Move out, Marcus whispered. They emerged from the drainage system into the elementary school's basement, a familiar maze of boiler rooms and storage areas that felt like a dollhouse version of the industrial complexes where Marcus had fought his war. The hegemony soldiers had secured the main entrances, but they hadn't bothered with the maintenance areas, a mistake that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of human resourcefulness. The sound of children crying echoed through the ventilation system, mixed with the calm voices of teachers trying to maintain order in an impossible situation. Mrs. Patterson's voice was strongest, reading a story about brave knights and magical kingdoms to children who were living through something far more terrifying than any fairy tale. Marcus led his team, through corridors lined with artwork and achievement certificates, past classrooms where children had been learning about friendship and sharing just hours before. The incongruity was almost overwhelming. The innocent decorations of childhood surrounded by the clinical efficiency of an alien occupation. At the main hallway intersection, they encountered their first hegemony guard. The creature was focused on its handheld scanner, probably monitoring the containment vehicle's collection parameters. It never saw the fire axe that Kevin Park swung with deadly precision, or the improvised explosives that turned the intersection into a crater. The elementary school erupted into controlled chaos. Team Alpha's diversions triggered hegemony response protocols, drawing soldiers away from the primary collection site. Team Charlie's covering fire kept the remaining guards pinned down while Team Beta moved through the building like a rescue operation that had been planned for months. Instead of hours, Marcus found the children huddled in the gymnasium, 40 small faces looking up at him with the trust that only very young humans could maintain in the face of absolute terror. Mrs. Patterson stood in front of them like a protective shield, her voice steady as she continued reading her story about heroes who saved the day. "It's okay," Marcus told the children, his voice gentle despite the weapons fire echoing through the building. "We're here to take you home. The Dura evacuation was textbook perfect, a flowing movement of small bodies guided by teenagers who had learned military tactics from video games and applied them with deadly seriousness. Jenny Park carried a kindergartner who was too scared to walk. Sarah Chen provided medical attention to a second grader who had been injured by falling debris. Kevin Park covered their withdrawal with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered his calling. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Marcus looked back at the elementary school where containment vehicles sat empty, and hegemony soldiers struggled to understand how their perfectly planned operation had been completely dismantled by a force they hadn't considered a threat. 40 children were safe. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same hallway where his story had begun, but everything had changed. The walls were reinforced with adaptive armor plating. The lockers had been replaced with weapons storage units, and the familiar sounds of teenage chatter now included tactical discussions and alien language translation exercises. Jefferson High School had become the headquarters of the Terran Youth Defense Corps, and students from around the world came here to learn how to fight a war that their parents' generation had tried to keep secret. The old lie about humanity's safety had died in a high school cafeteria, replaced by a truth that was both more terrifying and more hopeful than anyone had imagined. "The hegemony fleet is holding position at the outer asteroid belt," Jenny Park reported during the morning briefing. She wore the insignia of a senior intelligence analyst now, her red hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail, but her green eyes carrying the weight of knowledge that most adults couldn't handle. "They're not advancing, but they're not retreating either." "Standoff," Marcus said. "They're trying to figure out what went wrong." What had gone wrong from the hegemony's perspective was everything. The failed harvest operation at Jefferson High had triggered a cascade of events that no xenosociologist in their empire had predicted. Instead of covering up the alien presence, Earth's governments had been forced to acknowledge the truth. Instead of panicking, humanity had done something characteristic and completely unexpected. They had adapted. Kevin Park entered the briefing room, his fire axe replaced by a more sophisticated weapon, but his role essentially unchanged. He commanded the school's rapid response teams now, teenagers who could move through urban environments with the fluid grace of water finding its level. "The Australian cells are reporting successful infiltration of the hegemony mining operation on Titan. Apparently, a group of high school students from Sydney managed to reprogram their extraction equipment to mine worthless rock instead of strategic metals." Marcus smiled. The Sydney operation had been planned by 16-year-olds who had learned military strategy from Marcus's own combat reports, then improved on his tactics with innovations that no professional soldier would have considered. The hegemony was discovering that humans became exponentially more dangerous when they were allowed to share information and coordinate their efforts. David Park looked up from his quantum communication array, now a sophisticated piece of equipment that linked resistance cells across 3 star systems. "I'm getting reports from the Kepler colonies. The hegemony tried to establish a research station on Kepler 438b, but the colonist children sabotaged it using techniques they learned from our training videos. The training videos had been Jenny's idea, detailed instructions on asymmetric warfare, alien psychology, and resistance tactics, distributed through social media platforms that the hegemony couldn't monitor effectively. Within weeks, human children across the galaxy were causing problems for an empire that had never had to deal with organized juvenile resistance. "What about the diplomatic situation?" Marcus asked. Colonel Martinez, now permanently assigned to the school as military liaison, shook her head grimly. "The peace faction is still pushing for surrender. They argue that continued resistance will only result in Earth's complete destruction." "Do they understand what surrender means?" Sarah Chen asked. She had become the school's chief medical officer, her biology background proving invaluable for treating both human and alien injuries. "I've seen the hegemony's medical research protocols. Surrender means becoming test subjects for the rest of human existence." Marcus had seen those protocols too, captured during the raid on the research vessel that had been intended to process Jefferson High's students. The hegemony's concept of scientific ethics would have made medieval torturers queasy. Surrender wasn't survival. It was just a slower form of extinction. The peace faction thinks they can negotiate special terms, Colonel Martinez explained. Protected status, limited autonomy, cultural preservation agreements. The hegemony doesn't make special deals, Marcus replied. They make examples. Through the reinforced windows of the former chemistry lab, Marcus could see students practicing combat drills in what used to be the football field. Teenagers from dozens of countries all learning to fight an enemy that their governments had tried to appease. They moved with the confidence of young people who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and decided it wasn't impressive enough to justify surrender. Communication alert chimed through the school's intercom system. David's fingers flew across his control interfaces as he established connection with an incoming transmission. "This is Admiral Chen of the Hegemony Colonial Authority," a synthesized voice announced. "I am authorized to offer final terms for Earth's integration into the Empire." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded combat. Final terms meant the diplomatic window was closing. Whatever happened next would determine whether humanity survived as a free species or joined the thousands of others who had accepted the safety of slavery. "Put him through to the main auditorium," Marcus said. "The whole school should hear this." 5 minutes later, 300 teenagers sat in the auditorium where they used to attend assemblies about school spirit and college preparation. Now they listened to an alien admiral explain why their species should surrender its freedom for the promise of continued existence. Human resistance activities have caused significant disruption to hegemony operations. Admiral Chen's translated voice echoed through the speakers. "However, continued defiance will result in the systematic elimination of your species. We offer one final opportunity for peaceful integration." "What are the terms?" Marcus asked, speaking into the microphone that connected to the hegemony vessel. "Complete disarmament of human military forces, dissolution of resistance organizations, mandatory relocation of human populations to designated preserve worlds, submission to hegemony authority in all matters of governance, reproduction, and cultural development. Preserve worlds." Marcus had read the intelligence reports about other species' preserve worlds. They were essentially zoos where conquered populations were maintained in carefully controlled environments, while their children were gradually modified to serve hegemony needs. "And if we refuse?" Jenny asked. "Then humanity will be classified as a failed integration subject. Your worlds will be sterilized, your species archived for research purposes." The auditorium was completely silent. 300 teenagers absorbed the reality of their situation. Surrender and become pets or fight and face extinction. It was the kind of choice that had broken entire civilizations. Then Kevin Park started laughing. It began as a quiet chuckle, but it spread through the auditorium like wildfire. Soon 300 young voices were laughing at the threat of annihilation, and Admiral Chen's synthesized voice took on a note of confusion. "You find these terms amusing?" Marcus stood up, still laughing, and walked to the microphone. "Admiral, you've made a fundamental mistake about our species. Explain." "You think we're afraid of dying. You think that's what motivates us. But you're wrong." Marcus looked around the auditorium at faces that reflected every nation and culture on Earth, all united by something the hegemony couldn't understand. "We're not afraid of dying. We're afraid of not living. Your distinction is meaningless. No, Admiral. It's everything." Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone who had stared into the abyss and chosen to stare back. "You're offering us survival without purpose, existence without meaning. You want us to choose safety over freedom, and you can't understand why that's not a choice at all." Sarah Chen stood up next. "We've seen your preserve worlds, Admiral. We know what happens to species that accept your protection." David Park joined them at the microphone. "We've studied your integration protocols. We understand exactly what peaceful cooperation means in your empire." One by one, the entire student body stood up. 300 voices spoke in unison, delivering humanity's answer to the hegemony's final offer. "We refuse." Admiral Chen's response was immediate. "Then you have chosen extinction." "No," Marcus replied, his voice calm and steady. "We've chosen to be human." The connection ended, and the school's early warning systems immediately began detecting massive energy signatures from the hegemony fleet. The final assault was beginning, and Earth would either survive as a free world or be reduced to cosmic dust. But in the auditorium of Jefferson High School, 300 teenagers smiled at each other with the quiet confidence of people who had already won the only victory that mattered. They had remained human in the face of annihilation, and that was worth more than mere survival. The galaxy was about to learn why some species were too dangerous to conquer, even when they could be destroyed. It wasn't because they were too strong to defeat. It was because they would rather die free than live as anything less than themselves. And sometimes, when a species makes that choice with absolute conviction, the universe finds a way to honor it.